Hi, my name is Joel Christ. I'm a developer with Acona Systems, and today I'm going to be doing a walkthrough of some sample code that illustrates using Excel services with SharePoint Server 2007 to take a snapshot of an Excel workbook. Okay, let's look at some code. Right now we're looking at some C# code for a console application in Visual Studio 2005. Right now it doesn't do much of anything, but we're going to add some code that's going to allow us to take a snapshot of a workbook that I've already uploaded and published to a Microsoft SharePoint Server 2007 site. First thing we're going to do is we're going to add a web reference to our project to the Excel Services web service that's running on that SharePoint site. The way I do that is I come in here and right click on web references in the project and I choose to add web reference. Now I could type in the URL to the ASMX file, the web service file for the Excel Services web service, but I've already accessed this web service as part of my testing. And so Visual Studio remembers that for me, which is nice. So I'm just going to pick that right there. And it'll go out in Visual Studio, gets the information about the web service and shows it all the methods that it supports and everything else for me here. Now if you look, you can see that the Excel Services web service is simply called excelservice.asmx, and it lives on the SharePoint site in the _VTI_bin folder. So that's what you would have to type in to add a reference to your own instance of the Excel Services web service running on your SharePoint site. I'm going to give this web reference a different name so it's a little bit more friendly, and we're going to call it Excel Web Service Original, and we're going to choose to add a reference to our project. Okay, so what Visual Studio did just now is it went out and using that information that it had gathered about the functionality and the services offered by that web service, is it generated a namespace for me and a bunch of classes and with methods in that namespace that are going to allow me to make calls against that web service. So let's add some code to do just that. So I've already typed in a bunch of code over here. I'm going to do copies and pastes so that you don't have to watch me type. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some using statements here. First two for the IO and the protocols namespaces, those are used down in the code we're going to add down here below, mainly so that we can, the IO namespace is used to allow us to dump out the bytes that we get back from the web service that represents the snapshot. And the protocols namespace allows us to do some exception handling to handle SOAP exceptions that might get thrown when we make method calls against the Excel Services web service. Now this next using statement though is specifying the Excel web service namespace that was created for us by Visual Studio when we added that web reference to the Excel Services web service. And this Excel web service namespace here has all the classes and what have you that we're going to want to work with. So let's add some code down here that's going to allow us to make calls against the web service. So let's go ahead and paste the code in here and let's start walking through and looking at what it does. Okay, it's just a simple console application again. It accepts one command line argument. In this case here, it's the path or the URL to the workbook that we want to ask for the snapshot of. And then it does a sanity check to make sure that it was given that one argument, otherwise it fails. But if it has the one argument, the code then comes down here and starts to get ready to work with the Excel service, Excel Services web service. And the first thing it does is it creates an instance of an Excel service class. And this Excel service class here lives in that Excel Services web service namespace that we created. It was generated for us by Visual Studio. This is a proxy class for the web service. So we can create an instance of this thing and make method calls against it. And internally, it'll take those method calls and it has the plumbing and the wiring necessary to remote those calls up to the web service running on the SharePoint site and then return back the results of the method calls to us. So we create an instance of the Excel service class, stuff it in a variable right here. We declare ourselves an array of status objects called status, and what these are going to be used for is for the Excel web service to return status information to us regarding method calls that we're making on whether or not they were successful. Okay, so the next thing the code does is it comes down here and it sets some of the standard web service proxy class properties. It sets two of them. It sets the timeout value, which is the maximum amount of time that we want to wait for the web service request to complete. And then it sets some credentials on the proxy class as well to specify who we want the methods to execute on the behalf of. And in this case here, we're specifying just the current user's logon credentials. Now, if we look down here, we start getting into lines of code that actually are making calls against the web service. And the first call that's made is Open Workbook. And Open Workbook accepts as the first parameter the path of the URL to the workbook that we want to open. And it returns a session ID. Now, everything with Excel services and the web service is based on the session that it's operating in. So in this case here, we need to hang on to the session ID because we're going to need to use it down below and when we make our other method calls. So we stuff the session ID returned off into the session ID variable. The next call that we make is to the get workbook method, and this is the one that actually is going to return the snapshot for us. So you can see it takes the session ID that we got back up above in the open workbook method call, and then as the second parameter it takes this enumerated type of the workbook type here, and in this case here we're specifying the published items snapshot value. What that's telling Excel services is up on the server is that we want to return, we want to have it return to us rather, a snapshot that includes just the published items. So when a workbook is published to a SharePoint site, the person who's doing the publishing can specify that there's a subset maybe of all the items in the workbook that they want to have published. Like maybe you don't want every worksheet in the workbook to be published. You just simply want one worksheet to be published, or you want only certain named ranges to be published. And so you can specify those when you do the publishing to the SharePoint site or to Excel services. So what we're specifying here is we want Excel services to simply return just the published items to us. And again, we're giving it the status array here so that it can tell us if the call succeeds or fails. So upon return from the method call, we get back an array of bytes right here, which we're stuffing into the workbook variable. And that array of bytes now represents the snapshot that we're asking for. There's a couple of lines of code down below here that are commented out to show a couple of the other possible values that you can specify for this second parameter. We could specify a full snapshot, which would basically be a snapshot of the workbook, not just those published items, but all items in the workbook. But again, it would be a snapshot. It wouldn't be a full-on copy of the workbook. So it would be no formulas and that type of stuff there. It would just be the calculated values, no data connections, but it would be a full snapshot. It wouldn't just be published items. We could also specify full workbook, which would basically pull down a full-blown copy of the workbook. Now to make this call and to have it succeed, whoever is making the method call here, the user that we're operating on behalf of, would have to have open privileges on the workbook on the SharePoint site in order for this call or the call to succeed with this value. But for what we're going to do here, we're just going to simply ask for the published items and ask for those in a snapshot. So we do that. Excel services returns this byte array that represents the snapshot of the workbook. The last thing we do is we call the close workbook method on the proxy class, passing again in our session ID, and this closes the session, allowing the server then to release any resources it's holding on our behalf. And what this is basically good behavior that you should always do. This allows you to proactively tell the server that, hey, we're done with this session, go ahead and release our resources. The server would eventually time the session out, but by doing it this way, we're just able to do a little bit more quickly and kind of be a good client. So at this point here, we now have our workbook snapshot in our byte array. So in order to do something with it, we're going to wire up a binary writer to standard output here. And we're going to tell it to write the contents of that byte array that represents our snapshot out to standard out, and then we're going to close the binary writer. So again, what this will do is that this would write the bytes that represent that snapshot out to standard out, but since the usage pattern for this test application is to redirect the output going to standard out to a file, that's going to create a local file for us that's going to represent the snapshot of that workbook up on the SharePoint site. So let's go ahead and take a look. If we run that, I've got an instance of the application wired up to a command file here. If we take a look at it, what this command file does is it executes get snapshot.exe, goes ahead and feeds it the URL to the workbook that we want to take the snapshot of, and then redirects the output again that's being written to standard out to a file called inventory.xlsx, which is sitting on my desktop. So if we go ahead and run this, it kicks off a command window. We can see we now have a copy of the XLSX file on my desktop. And what Excel Services is doing right now is it's taking a snapshot of that workbook up on that remote SharePoint site, and it's pulling the bytes down for us. And then the second when it completes, we'll be able to open up this snapshot and take a look at it. And as you can see, it worked. We now have ourselves a local copy of the workbook. And in this case here, it pulled back just to published items, because when I published this workbook up on the SharePoint site, there was actually several other sheets in this workbook. But when I published it, I chose to publish just this one worksheet called inventory list. So by specifying that I just wanted the published items, when I made that call to the Excel services web service, it returned just the published items, which in this case here was just the inventory list worksheet.